Hi everyone. This is Carl, and this is my presentation about annihilation in the archipelago. Essentially, what I'm going to talk about is part of a bigger a project that is interested in the conditions of geographical knowledge. By this I mean sort of what does it actually take to know the world in a way that can be called geographical? So of course, this is a question that depends on all manners of definitions. I think one way to investigate this, sorry, is to consider geographical knowledge as the product of a certain kind of subjectivity and examine precisely how it is negated in different circumstances. What happens when geography fails to do the thing to produce geographical knowledge in more and less dramatic ways? The following narrative then is part of a larger attempt to kind of collect stories about how geographers get lost and how geographical knowledge happens to fall apart. Geographer, we might think, is a figure who fulfills certain constraints that allows investigating their own place in the world and ultimately allows them to get around the world. It's a comportment towards space. And geographical knowledge perhaps depends on or even leads to a differentiating of the subject from the world. But what happens then when a geographer is drawn into space, when their interest in space in the outside world becomes perhaps too strong, and they depart on a journey that is a one-way journey. So today I want to follow John Trail's depiction of the 1897 Andrée expedition. A number of geographers have written about this expedition, and for instance, Derek McCormack wrote a couple of papers about the materialities of the atmosphere. But to just give a brief breakdown of it, and to kind of set up what I'm going to talk about next, the Swedish engineer Salomon August André essentially tries to be the first person to reach the North Pole using a balloon. And as one might expect in this kind of situation, at the end of the 19th century, it doesn't really go too well. As one can expect, the balloon sort of crashes quite soon after launch, and the monomaniacal André, together with his two other companions, attempt to gather some other data as he and his team they drift across the ice and they try to overwinter in the Arctic, and then they are ultimately end up on an island, and soon thereafter they pass away. It wasn't until decades later that their bodies were discovered. So this kind of story, this strange and absolutely crazy expedition, has of course spawned a huge interest by geographers and sort of writers and filmmakers. And John Trail's depiction in the film from 1982, The Flight of the Eagle, is what I'm going to be talking about today. These are pictures from photographs by Niels Strindberg, who was one of the members of the expedition, taken on the expeditions, and they were kind of later retrieved just to sort of see how poorly this goes. In any case, so in the film The Flight of the Eagle, there are two conversations between André and the third member of the expedition, Knut Frenkel. And each of these brief conversations take place on an island, and they sort of frame the disastrous expedition and serve as two moments of kind of retelling it and recreating it. And I'm interested in some of the things that are said there about the geographer's will and how it kind of interacts with what they are doing and with other people. And perhaps most interestingly, kind of the object of geographical knowledge, how that acts back on the geographer. So I'm going to kind of reenact these two scenes from the film. We'll see how it goes, since my voice is already giving up a little bit. So on the left, we see André and holding this little skull, and then On the right is Knut Frankel. The scene begins when they are kind of hunting around the location where they're going to launch the balloon from. And Frankel says, "Do you think the wind will ever turn?" Andre replies, "We're keeping an eye on it every day, but wishes and desires do not count for everything." Don't they? Replies Frankel. Both smile. Frankel points to the skeleton that Andre kind of subsequently picks up the skull from. "Who do you think he was?" "A trapper," Andre says. "A man equipped with a strong will always runs a great risk." "Which is?" asks Frankel. And then Andre says, "To be forced to subordinate himself to his own will." And Frankel doesn't understand, and he says so. To which Andre finally replies, "If..." "No." And then he simply trails off. To be forced to subordinate himself to his own will is the risk that a person with a strong will always runs. And here is the departing balloon photos by Alexis Macheron. Okay, I'm going to move straight to the second dialogue, which is on the same theme. And here is Frankel reading from Andre's diary, which is kind of also retrieved from the site. So is what the actual Andre wrote. "Why did you write like that in the diary? You left it in the open for us, and you wanted us to read it. 12th of July. The first to sail here in a balloon. When will I have any successors? I. Not we. I. And then I cannot deny that a feeling of pride governs all three of us. You have been gripped by a feeling that governs us, all three of us. You knew the whole time that we would fail. You knew it. We believe that we can face death, having done what we have done. You knew it. You knew it the whole time. I wonder if it's all because of a tremendous sense of individuality which could not endure to live and die as an anonymous man, forgotten by future generations. Is this ambition? Is this ambition?" Frankel finally exclaims. At this point, I should mention that Strindberg is already dead, and they're sort of mourning his death in a tent, which you can see in the background here. So Andrea leaves the tent to escape Frankel's onslaught, and then finally he explodes and throws a rock in the ground, which is what you see on the screen here. And he says, "I had no choice." A moment later, Frankel catches up to Andrea, who's now crying, and embraces him and apologizes. Andrea says that, I had no choice. We had to set out." And intriguingly enough, Frankel will say that you had no choice. We had to set out. We had to set out. And they just continue like this and trail off. And in the following scene, Frankel is eaten by a bear, and Andre is left to die alone in the tent. So, of course, Frankel initially here only sees the narcissistic pride that has cost them their lives. But he's kind of like recaptured by Andre's will when he turns to console him. You had no choice. Important in this matter is, of course, that Andre had a choice. He's been borrowing money, he's been organizing, he's been created this kind of enormous media hype to go on this expedition. But he sees that he had no choice. Perhaps he is driven by ambition, but nevertheless, he sees sort of how his will has been captured and defeated by the archipelago. He has already left his life behind, but in doing so, of course, he also virtually annihilates his companions too. And both are correct here. Since the archipelago, in a way, sort of is a lure that destroys the relations that enable geographical knowledge. Physically, yes, of course, but also by working on the will. Let me explain this. Someone who has to subordinate themselves to their own will can end up with kind of subject to a will that sort of is self-annihilating. A will that kind of wills its own annihilation by willing the wrong kind of object. Andre really wants to get to the Arctic, but in doing so, he's sort of caught in this sort of image of a traversable Arctic that is a lure that literally draws him in. It poses a sort of conceptual recapitulation of the painterly term of a vanishing point, the sort of infinite point that we chase and we build an entire perspective around. The North Pole is sort of an attachment point of a line that draws the explorer in and also, meanwhile, sends them astray as the winds sort of don't really do what he hopes that they will. And of course, one could perhaps speculate that this is evidence for a death drive, or perhaps it can also be a question of simply bad fortune, the bad fortune of being captured by an object of desire that is antithetical to one's own existence. A question, perhaps, of what might be called a volitional luck, following Williams and debate with exchange with Nagel to philosophers around the idea of moral luck. So the question I just want to end on here is essentially the extent how geography intrinsically, by being related to kind of an object of knowledge, draws a space, and by drawing this space, literally draws us in. And I think we must be very wary of this sort of how this can go wrong, because truly we can end up in a situation where we no longer have a choice in sort of the objects of research we pursue and the sort of the strong drive with which we pursue them with. And of course, the islands in the archipelago here sort of poses this lure, this sort of little point that draws, or the North Pole here literally, really draws the explorer in to send him astray. Thank you for listening. I hope it wasn't too much over time.